Remember that in section 10.1, what we're doing is establishing some basic foundation for all hypothesis testing, which will hold true for chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. So the first thing we learned how to do was how hypothesis test step 1 is going to work. You're going to always have to create a null and alternative hypotheses. And we have our first types of null and alternative hypotheses here with right-tailed and left-tailed and two-tailed tests. Then you also need to learn how to write step 5 and step 6. Now, why we make the decisions we make, which is step 5, well, making the decisions is actually step 5, and then step 6 will be writing the conclusions. Now, in step 5, you're going to have only 2 options possible to you ever. And this is true for chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on. You're either going to reject your null hypothesis or do not reject your null hypothesis. You can write it as this: reject H naught, do not reject H naught. That's H naught, by the way, N-A-U-G-H-T, as in all for naught. It's an old-fashioned word meaning nothing, right? Okay, so we will never, never, never write the words except. We will never write prove, right? We're not proving anything, right? We either reject or we do not reject. And the reason we don't prove anything is because in order to prove something, you'd have to have access to the entire population. You'd have to know everything. And we don't know everything because we're always working with a sample. And that means we always don't know the exact value of the parameter. We know what we think it is, but we don't know for sure what it is. Then when we make those decisions in step 5, we're going to follow up with some writing of conclusions in step 6. So if you get to reject the null hypothesis, that first one, let me put it right here. So if you reject the null hypothesis, I'll color it yellow. Then this is the conclusion you get to write. Okay, you will write, there is sufficient, you could write enough, that's fine, sufficient evidence to support the claim. And then the claim in H1, that phrase, this back half part, you have to write it in context. You'll have to write it out in English what it was. So you can't just say the claim in H1. You have to say, the claim that was made, blah, 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 and explain what it was. If you do not reject H naught, then you're going to get to say the other one, which is there is not sufficient evidence. I'll make that one pink. There is not sufficient evidence to support the claim in H1. Notice how these are exactly the same phrase. It's just that this one has the word not in it, right? And then the claim in H1, again, has to get all written out in context. So let's practice that. So we have this example from before where boxes of a certain kind of cereal are labeled as containing 16 ounces. An inspector thinks that the mean weight may be less than this. He collects a random sample of cereal boxes and decides to weigh them to test his idea. So if the inspector decides to reject the null hypothesis, okay, so he's rejecting the null hypothesis. How would he write the conclusion? Okay, so he would say there is sufficient evidence to support the claim that, right? So that part always this stays the same. And you could say enough evidence to support the claim. That's the only word you can swap out in there. So you could say enough evidence, sufficient evidence. Some students like the word enough better. That's fine. To support the claim that. Now, what was the claim? Well, the claim that he's making is the mean weight is less than this. See that right there? And I put it up here as well. Less than this, right? So the mean weight is less. So that's what he thinks is going on at the cereal factory. So he's claiming that the average weight of the cereal boxes is less than 16 ounces. Or you could say the mean weight of the cereal boxes is less than 16 ounces. There we go. So that phrase right there, right, that green phrase is getting written out in English down here. All right, now what if he decided to not reject the null hypothesis? All right, so do not reject H naught. What would we write then? Well, it'd be the same thing. It's just that there would be the word not in there. So you're going to say there is not sufficient evidence. Matter of fact, I'll just copy and paste the whole thing, which I realize I've got an advantage over you because you're probably writing by hand, but take a moment, pause me. There we go, and write it out. So it's the exact same phrase because it's still the same claim. You're claiming that it's less, or he is claiming that it's less than 16 ounces, and you do not have enough evidence to support that. That's the difference, the word not. Everything else is exactly the same. Now notice this is kind of strange. So we decide to reject or not reject the null hypothesis in step 5. So in step 5, the decision is regarding the null hypothesis. There. But in step 6, we write about the alternative hypothesis. So we make decisions regarding the null hypothesis in step 5, right? In step 5. But in step 6, we discuss the alternative. So it's kind of strange. Step 5 is always about the null, H0, and the step 6 is always about the alternative. But as long as you follow the little structure we have up here, where the yellow one goes with the yellow one and the pink one goes with the pink one, you'll never go wrong. And the other thing to notice here, and it's kind of what this this little cartoon is making a joke about over here, which is that we have to be kind of cautious about rejecting the null hypothesis, right? So it's assumed to be true. And you need strong evidence in order to reject that. So because it's assumed to be true, you're going to let it stand unless you get pretty strong evidence. Now, how strong is strong enough? Well, we'll talk about that in a later video. It's having to do with alpha, in fact. But you need pretty strong evidence because you assumed it to be the case, right? And if you want to reject that, you need to get past a reasonable doubt at the very least. It's very much sort of like a legal case, right, where you're assuming innocence unless you can prove guilt, kind of a thing. So you assume something to be the case unless you have really enough evidence to compile against that null hypothesis.